cloud. All right, so what we're covering today, and we'll probably have some time at the end of class if you want it. If you have any questions you want to talk about regarding the final exam, I'll answer what I can there. But today is not about VBA at all. Microsoft invented VBA in the early 1990s. The first version of Microsoft Excel to have VBA was released in 1995. I think you might have been able to get it in 1994, but it was the one that was really broadly available in 1995. And that language, Visual Basic, which is what it was based on, is now completely defunct. Microsoft isn't doing anything with the Visual Basic language anymore, except what's in VBA. It's like the only thing that's kind of still going. And they would really like to get rid of VBA. But the one thing Microsoft understands about the strength of Excel's position in the marketplace is that it is backwards compatible. So when you get the next version of Excel, the stuff you had in Excel before is going to keep working. They understand how important backward compatibility is. So you're going to be able to keep using what you got in VBA for the rest of your careers, I expect. But Microsoft's really not pushing that frontier forward. The way that they're pushing forward now is using another technology, JavaScript. Have you heard of it? The language JavaScript. Just raise your hand if you've heard of it. So it is actually by far the most popular language in the world right now. If you look at like job postings for what are people hiring for, it's more JavaScript than anything else. And I think what really drove them to go to JavaScript was that they had VBA for Windows from the very beginning. We didn't get VBA into the Mac version. I'm not sure when it happened, but in the 2008 version, they took it out. It was like they had it for a while, they took it out, they finally brought it back in the 2011 version. And it didn't really get parity with the Windows version until relatively recently, like maybe 2019, 2018. So like since you guys have been students is when the Mac version of VBA really got to where you'd say, you know what, it's as good as there is in Windows. There's lots of stuff we can do in Windows that you can't do in the Mac, but it's because there are objects that are available on the Windows that aren't available on the Mac. There's some things you can do in VBA on the Mac you can't do in Windows. It's really kind of some interesting disparities there. But anyway, it was a long road to get that compiler doing what it needed to do on that different operating system. And then we got lots of other versions of Excel. What are the other versions of Excel that are out there besides Mac and Windows? Do you know? There's one for iOS. There's one for Android. There's one for the web. I don't know if they ever made one for Windows Mobile or not, but it's gone now anyway. So the thought of saying, how are we going to get VBA, automation on those platforms? How much work it was to make that VBA editor work in Mac to try to do that again. They just said it's just too much work. But there's already a language that's cross-platform compatible on all of those platforms, and it was JavaScript. So they said, well, maybe what we should do, maybe the way forward here is to say, well, let's create a way to be able to automate Excel using JavaScript. And so that's what they did. In fact, they first released that in 2013. And in 2013, like the functionality that you could do with it was minuscule. But it was like, okay, here it is. It's almost like a preview. You could change cells, and that was about it. You want to create a new worksheet? No, can't do that. You want to create a new workbook? Not possible. So since then, they've been working pretty furiously to be able to build in the functionality to be able to have it accessible from JavaScript, to where today it's, in terms of working like in an existing workbook, it is nearly equal to VBA. But you still can't make new workbooks with it. You're kind of limited to working in the work. Well, that may not be true. But anyway, definitely working inside an existing workbook, there's a lot you can do. But some of the things that we did, like reaching out and opening files from the operating system, you can't do that at all. And there's no plan to make that available in JavaScript. So it's kind of always going to be a little bit more limited. And part of that is they're trying to improve the security. You remember, or maybe you don't remember, the trouble with macro viruses. Have you even heard of a macro virus? Yeah, some of you have, so that's good. So it turns out that if you were clever enough to write a real virus, not a macro virus, but a real virus, that is some really clever coding. I mean, it is, you got to be brilliant to do that. You don't have to be brilliant to write a macro virus, because what's a macro virus? Macro virus is just like a VBA program that runs and does something malicious when you open the workbook. There's nothing clever about it. It's just 100% devious. What's the right word I'm thinking of? Like evil, but evil is not the right word. But anyway, yeah, it's just, you don't have to be that smart. You can do really bad stuff because VBA was so powerful. Like you reach in and modify files on the operating system and whatever. And so because JavaScript is made to work in the browser and has kind of had security from the beginning, there's just a lot more restrictions in terms of what you're able to do. So it's going to be, so what I'm going to show you today is going to be more restricted, but it's going to be, it's going to have kind of broader reach because it's available in all of the platforms that Excel runs. So I think the one that's really going to get traction is the online version of Excel. So in fact, I'm not sure that Microsoft is even going to continue development on the iOS and the Android platform, because on those platforms, of course, you can just access the online version of Excel. So that's really where they're pushing their current development. So if I was to, I'm kind of curious to know why I don't see the My Educator add-in here. Interesting. Let me just kind of come take a look at the add-ins. By the way, I'm coming here to the add-in store. And this add-in store, all of these are add-ins that have been written using this VBA technology that I'm going to show you today. So here's the My Educator add-in. I'm curious if I can even just add this here. Continue. Yeah, so I was able to add it back in. So, so kind of when we look at this, you're currently blocked to protect security of your computer. Do you still have the that add-in on your version of Excel? Like the My Educator add-in, is it there still? This data query is one that I showed you before. It's one that I wrote, but there's actually a problem with the web server that's serving it right now. It's really frustrating. I think I'm going to have to move to a different platform. It's going to be really, really painful to do. Let's at least get one more up here if we can find another one. So insert, get add-ins. Yeah, and it may be that on this version, like this installation, it's not going to let me add any add-in in here. Here's data.world. Let me see if I can add that one. So publish insights. No, same thing. So I think that what we have going on here is that BYU is kind of controlling what we're allowed to add on here. I bet if I logged out from here, I wonder if that would work. I'm not even sure I can switch account. I'm not going to worry about it. Oh, yeah, I have to, because I have to be able to show this to you. I've got to be able to put an add-in in here. Add an account. Let me see if I can get to my just regular one. Don't use this account very often. I hope I remembered what it was. All right, let me see if I can add an add-in now here. Maybe it'll just let me open this one. No good. I think if I'm going to show this to you today, I'm going to need to borrow someone's computer. So anybody who wants to let me work class on their computer, if no one volunteers, I like dismiss class early and say, well, that was all we could do. All right, bring your computer up here and let's see if we can get it connected. So we've got a few folks on Zoom. We're going to see if we can join Zoom here. Don't go away in case I need you for something here. So Zoom, or actually, why don't you just go to our class on Learning Suite and follow the link to Zoom. I'll stop sharing here. Let's see, online. So on the day that we canceled class earlier this semester for doing like MBA business trips, I actually went over this content with the folks who are interested to see it then. It installed just fine on the Podium computer. So they've made some changes here recently. Okay, we'll share the screen. Thank you. I think I can handle it from here. Oh. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up Excel. And I've got a blank workbook here. So yeah, if we look here at the My Educator add-in, which I think is going to work for you okay. Yeah. So the point is that this add-in that we're seeing here was written using this, using JavaScript and the Excel API. And hopefully it will actually load. So you don't really need it to load. I think you're all familiar with that. Oh no, we don't use this add-in for this class. This is the one that's used for teaching the Introduction to Excel class. And there's no, I don't really have a compelling reason to actually look at it, but just to kind of say, so here's Solver. Let's see, Solver. Again, this version of Solver was written using this approach. So kind of any of the stuff you see here is stuff you can do. Now, the thing to realize is that this, JavaScript is a web technology. It was written for working with the internet. And so this is going to be quite a bit different than working with VBA. But this little window that we have over here on the right, we can control this window using the kinds of things we would use for the web. So we can create forms, essentially just right here in this window using HTML. Well, let's go ahead then and kind of see how this works. So I'm going to close this one and we're going to start off by installing, a little more history. So Microsoft created this platform to be able to create these add-ins. And I imagined that they would be, making it easy for end users to be able to use the same technology. And I believe they are kind of in the process of building it out and calling it, they're kind of branding it a thing called Office Script. And it's actually available in some kind of pre-release versions of Excel right now, but it's not ready for prime time yet. Even though kind of the tools to build the add-ins using this are really pretty mature at this point. Anyway, last December, I was just kind of thinking about add-ins and I thought, I think it would be possible to write an add-in that would let people write JavaScript and actually do automation like we do with VBA, but to do it right in JavaScript, just in an add-in. And so the add-in that I'm going to have you install is actually an add-in that I wrote to allow you to do this kind of automation. And so to get that, I'm going to come to the Insert tab. And then I'm going to come to add-ins. Am I editing a cell or something? Yeah. Then under add-ins, I'm going to choose Get Add-ins. This is going to take me to the Microsoft Add-in Store. And the add-in is called Jade, which is an acronym for the JavaScript Automation Development Environment. So if I search for Jade, it should come up here as the top result. So automate your workflow using JavaScript and the Excel API, storing your code in an XLS workbook. So one of the interesting things here is that by building this automation into the workbook, we'll continue. By building this automation into the workbook, it is going to allow you to have automations in a workbook that's not an XLS-M workbook. It'll be an XLS-X workbook. So there are some companies that, for instance, my former students tell me that at Goldman Sachs, you're not allowed to use VBA at all. It's like not installed or it's disabled on all Goldman Sachs machines. Why? Because you can do kind of crazy things with VBA and they think the risk is more than the benefit is. So if you're at a company that didn't allow you to use VBA and it did allow you to install add-ins, then you could install this add-in and do automation there using the approach that we're looking at today. So here it just looks like a little script here, says automation development. I'll click on that and it will open up the Jade add-in. Now this window I can resize, which I will do. And I'm gonna want as much screen estate here as I can get. So I'm gonna collapse down the ribbon just by double clicking on one of the tabs. So that ribbon is now still there, just a little smaller. Okay, so this is what Jade looks like. Now, the very first thing that we're going to do is we are going to add a code module. So right now, at this point, Jade hasn't actually done anything to your workbook. It's just you've opened the add-in and it hasn't kind of built any infrastructure into the workbook. But as soon as we say we're going to add a code module, then what that does is, if we give it a name, and I'm going to call it demo, D-E-M-O, and say add, that now is going to create a block of code that is now a part of this workbook. When I save the workbook, this block of code is going to get saved. It's actually kind of two steps. I'm going to save it inside my add, and I'll say, yeah, that change I want to save. But then when I save the workbook overall is when that will then be a part of it. And so is this text big enough for you to see? Okay, the code here. I think I'm limited to going half the width of the Excel window, so I can't go any wider. Okay, and so this module is analogous to a VBA module. It's just a place where I write different functions. And in VBA, the lingo is procedures. We had a sub procedure, we had a function procedure. In JavaScript, they're all just called functions. And so by default, it brings in a couple of examples here. The first one is a function called write timestamp. And when I run it, all it does is put the current time into the active cell. So I'm over here, I've got B2 selected on my worksheet, and I've selected like whatever functions I have here, those are the ones that can be the function that I'm running. So I've got these two, one called auto exec, one called write timestamp. I'm just going to run write timestamp, and it's going to execute that code, and all it does is put the current time into the active cell. So there's a little more complexity here than we have when dealing with VBA. The first one here is that some of these functions need to be asynchronous functions. It is a completely different level. There's nothing like the idea of an asynchronous function in VBA. The idea behind an asynchronous function is, this function can run and just kind of go let it run, and it might take a while to run. Great, just let it go run and we can move on to do other things. And so similar to the idea of when we do like a web query, we can say, hey, let's pause the code here until the web query is done running. Or we could let that run and our code could keep going on. But you can actually kind of make that same distinction between functions now. And so that'll be kind of an extra level of complexity, and we may talk a little bit more about it today. This comment here, this is the comment character for a multi-line comment. If I'm doing a single line comment, the character is a single quote in VBA, but in JavaScript, it's it's two forward slashes. So slash slash is anything else on the rest of that line is a quote. If it's a multi-line quote, or multi-line comment, I can say slash star is the beginning of it, and then star slash is the end of it. So anything between those identifiers is going to be just a large block, a large comment block. With this particular listing here, the Jade environment will actually kind of looks for a properly formatted comment in the code, and it will give me a way to execute this, kind of from a user interface perspective. So I'm going to click where it says demo module here, and that's going to open up some choices. And I'm going to come back to the home screen. That's the one that we see when we log in. And now I'm just going to come down to here where it says list automations. And so for every function that we've written that has that comment properly formatted at the top of it, then it will say, oh, here's the it's called timestamp, and there's a description of what it does. But importantly here is that this now becomes a link that you could follow. So, kind of one of the things you can do with the user interface here is you've got a few things, built into this, if you put the comment in right, it just becomes kind of a list here that you could then have your user use without having to think about user forms or menus or anything. You can just have a list of the things that your automations do right here. And that is driven, I'm going to come back to the code editor, open code editor. And that is driven by that comment. So it says a Jade listing, it has a name, timestamp, description, and so forth. And so, just part of what Jade does, it looks for that comment and builds that list of automations for the ones that you have properly formatted there. So one thing that we have to think about, the way that this works, in VBA, you just tell VBA to do something and it does it. It has direct access to the object model in Excel. But the JavaScript does not have direct access to the object model. And so what we do is there's several changes that we want to do. So we kind of say, get those changes ready. And then we'll say we want to sync those changes. And it will go do all of those at once. This architecture is here because it's pretty expensive computationally to get from the add-in environment into the workbook object structure. And so here we've said we're ready to put the value into the selected range of the workbook of Excel. But that line by itself doesn't do it. That just says, get that ready to go. And then when we say excel.sync, and that Excel is actually passed into this function. So kind of the reference to the Excel objects is passed in here. We'll call the sync method of that object. And that's what says, okay, we might have had 3 or 4 things that we set up to do here. Go ahead and do them all. And it's because like making that jump from JavaScript into the Excel object model is pretty expensive to do. So line up as much as you want to do and then do it. Okay, questions on what we've seen so far? Okay, so here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to do something a little more substantive here. So maybe we'll just kind of look at what it means to make an error here. So I'm going to change this instead of putting a new date in here. You're welcome to do this along with me or just to watch, that's fine. I'm going to change this to just a string literal. We use double quotes to identify string literals in VBA. We use double quotes to identify string literals in JavaScript, but you can also use single quotes. So if you have like a string that you want to put double quotes into, you can say, look, I'm just going to identify this string with single quotes, and then you could put a double quote in that and it wouldn't try to terminate the string. Well, what if you had to have double quotes and string? Well, it turns out you can also use the backtick as a string identifier. So you kind of have those 3 different things that you can use to identify a string, depending on what you want to put in it to kind of make it easier to use your different quotes. And so I'll go ahead and use the backticks here, that's fine. I'll just say hello world here. And so I've changed that code. So now when I run this, instead of putting the current time in, it should just write hello world. So I can change the code here, run it similar to the way that we do with VBA. I'm going to go ahead and make another function. Just because it's a little bit technical, all the things we have to do to get this working, I'm going to copy this first line. And I'm going to put it in here kind of as the second function. I think I'm going to copy it. Oh no, I'm on an IBM, which instead of the control, it's got a function where the control belongs. Curse. Copy it there. How do people live like this? I don't know. Did it take a long time to get used to? No. Interesting. My issue is that the function key is where the control normally is for me. Okay. So here, let's do this one. Instead of calling this write timestamp, I'm going to call this create worksheets. And then we're going to have this create several worksheets. All right, so again, the reference to my Excel environment is passed in here. So EXCEL. And then from the Excel application, I'm going to refer to the workbook. Now, the limitation of the JavaScript environment that the workbook I have access to is the workbook where the add-in is running. So it's not a workbooks collection that I have to tell it I want the active workbook. It's just the workbook. That's the only one I have access to. So just excel.workbook. And now I'm going to refer to the worksheets collection. So this worksheets collection is similar to the worksheets collection that we have in VBA. It's a collection of all the worksheets here in this workbook. And it has an add method like the one in VBA does. I am going to pass it the name of the worksheet that I want to create. So here I'm going to say add a new worksheet, and it's going to be, I'm just going to put the names of several varieties of apples. So there's one called Evercrisp. And that should create a worksheet, but remember that I've got to sync the changes that I want to do. So just having that by itself wouldn't do it. I've got to copy it and then paste that down in here. Okay, so now if I try to choose that down from the, if I try to choose this create worksheets function from my list here, Jade doesn't even know that that exists yet. So that's the one time that I really need to say save. So save doesn't save it out to disk. It saves the code that I'm working here into the object model so that Jade knows about it. So now I should be able to pick create worksheets from that list and run that, and we should watch it create a new worksheet down here. And so we've got that worksheet created. I'm going to add, let me add we'll add 4 worksheets with this. So I'm just going to copy this line. And I've already got one called Evercrisp, but let's make one called Fuji. What's your favorite kind of apple? Someone call it out. Golden Delicious. Fuji was nice. It was only 4 letters. Hinkley, that's a brand of it. Oh, the Pink Lady. Yeah, that's kind of a tart one, but very crisp. I like it. I'm going to go with one that's alphabetically smaller for the last one, Ambrosia. Because where we're headed with this is to say what we'd like to do next is kind of see what does it take to like sort the sheets alphabetically. So I'll have a bunch of worksheets here, and then I'm ultimately going to sort them alphabetically. So let me just go ahead and run these, and that should give me now several worksheets. So I've got those Fuji, Golden Delicious, and so forth, sheet 1, and all of these. Okay, so that's the idea. One other thing that I want to point out. So in VBA, we have to say, here's the beginning of my sub procedure, and here's the end of my sub procedure. And so we say sub to mark the beginning, we say end sub to mark the end. In JavaScript, the way that we say we've got a block of code here is to put that block of code inside of braces. So that kind of sometimes called a curly brace. That says this function is not just a single line, it's going to be multiple lines. And so anytime I say I've got multiple lines that I want to kind of go together, it's like a block of code, then I just put those inside of curly braces. And so that brace there opens the statements that are part of this function, and then this corresponding closing brace is going to be the one that closes it. And so everything inside of that is part of what gets run when I invoke this procedure. Go ahead, question. So you're saying when you learn JavaScript, then you would put a semicolon at the end of each line. And the answer is yes, kind of it's not just here that it's optional, but in all of JavaScript, now that semicolon is optional. So you don't have to put it at the end of the line. If you want to put 2 statements on the same line, you can put a semicolon between them and put 2 statements on the same line. But yeah, if you've got some experience with JavaScript and you think, you know what, I'd like to have that semicolon there, you can put it in, but it's not required. Which I think is really good. I don't think you should have to put a semicolon at the end, especially when we're just beginning to learn how to program. First language that I learned that required semicolons was Pascal, and it was like half of the problem was, oh yeah, I forgot the semicolon at the end of that line. And usually the error message that you got wasn't a helpful error message. It's like some other error message and you go, I have no idea what that's talking about. Okay, Any other questions about what we've done so far? All right. We're going to come back to this example here in just a second. I'm just going to show you some other things about Jade here. And that is, kind of the way I'm going to navigate is by clicking on this header bar here, and I can come right over here to a list of examples. And so I've got a bunch of examples built in here. So we'll add a worksheet. We've seen you want to add data to cells. This will bring up an example here of adding data to particular cells. This is all happening in a context of building a building an invoice generator here in Excel. So these examples will kind of show you individual steps, but it kind of shows you in the process of this overall example, which we're going to take a look at here a little bit later. Adding cells, what are we going to do? Here, we're getting the active worksheet. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and turn on word wrap, which is Alt-W, I think. Alt-Z. Is that what word wraps? Yeah, Alt-Z is going to turn the word wrap on for me. So const it's similar to const in VBA. What do we use const for in VBA? You have to create a constant. It's like a variable, but in VBA, you have to give it a fixed expression like at the time that you create it. So it can't be running any other code to figure out what the value is. So a constant is like a variable whose value you don't get to change. And that's the same thing it is here in JavaScript. The difference is that you can execute code to come up with its initial value. And so what I'm saying here is that I'm gonna want a variable for sheet, because I don't want to have to use this whole expression every time I want to get to the active worksheet. So what I'm saying is I want a variable that refers to that. Whatever the active sheet is, great. I'm going to bind this variable onto it. And so now anywhere else that I say sheet, it's referring to whatever object this found out. So similar to the way we use object variables in VBA, that's what we're doing here. I'm using const here instead of let or var, and the two ways that I can create variables in JavaScript, because I'm essentially saying, I'm not going to change this. Sheet is only ever going to get its value set once. I don't have to change it. And so that's kind of nice in the code, okay, I don't have to worry about changing it. In fact, if in my code, writing the code, I change it inadvertently, the compiler will say, you're not allowed to do that. You told me you weren't going to change this. So that's kind of nice. So interesting here, just to kind of walk through this code, it's saying, listen, we're going to get a particular range. So on that sheet, we're calling this method getRange. It's going to say, all right, this is going to refer to range A1 to A4. So similar, we'd say particular sheet and just use the range method and specify the range we're after. It's a different language, and here it's a different method. It's called getRange that refers to it. And then we're going to set the values of that range. Now, another thing that's different about JavaScript is that the way that we do an array is inside of square brackets. So just by putting something like a list of things inside of square brackets, that's an array. I don't have to declare the array and then add items into the array. I can just kind of out of thin air create an array, which is nice. And so this is actually a two-dimensional array. It's saying I've got this array here that has in it 4 different arrays. Now, each of these arrays only has one element in it. And so it's a two-dimensional array that so how do we say it? So this is going to be range A1 to A4. I'm going to be putting those values right here. But it does have to be a two-dimensional array, because the point is, let me just go ahead and change this. I'm going to make this, just for this example, I am going to put a second value out here. So let me just kind of put 1, just so you can see the two-dimensional nature of the array. 2, 3, 4. And so instead of A1 to A4, this is going to be A1 to B4. So now this is going to be my first row, which has 2 cells in it. Here's my second row, which has 2 cells in it, and so forth. And this is putting a lot of text. I'm just going to get rid of the rest of these. So it turns out these examples are editable. So I'm going to go ahead and edit that. And I think, trying to remember if I have to close the example and start it again, or if I can just say add data and it'll take those changes. No, it did everything. So I'm going to click on this to close it and then open it up again. And then I think it would make just those changes. And where's the delete? Delete, delete, delete. So now I should be able to run that, and it's just written that data into these cells. So that's kind of a couple things here. We're seeing how do you write data to cells, and kind of how do you work with the different examples that are available here in the environment. Any questions here? All right. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to do is we're going to import another code module. So on our blog for today, come over here to, oh, if only you knew how to work bookmarks. Control B, no. Okay, so I'm going to come to today's day in the blog, and we've got these two gists. Now, it turns out, how many of you are familiar with GitHub? So not very many of us. So if you're a programmer or a system student, you're definitely familiar with GitHub. GitHub is just a place where you can share code with other people, like a team's doing development on code. It's a repository. We have multiple people working on the code at the same time. Probably a good description of it. There's a kind of a subset of GitHub called a gist, and that's where you can just kind of share code openly. But because GitHub allows this sharing of code, I've set up actually the examples that we saw are actually stored in a GitHub gist. But if you have code that you want to share with someone else, you can publish that as a gist. And then you can actually import a code module that way as well. So what we're about to do is, instead of creating a code module and writing from scratch, we're saying, someone's got a code module that they want to share with me. And so it takes an identifier, and that's going to be over on this blog. It's just ID number 1. I'm just going to copy that ID. And again, this would be something that someone else has written and is now sharing with me. I'm going to paste that. I'm going to copy that ID, and I'm going to paste that here under import code module. And then I will say import, and that will just bring in that code. So it's a really easy way to be able to share code between developers. And so we've got something similar to what we wrote here in class. We had create sheets, and we just put in some various versions or various kinds of apples. But now we've got this example of sorting sheets. So this is a little bit involved. Let me kind of take you through it, and you'll see what it does. Okay, so here I'm binding on a variable called, in this case, a constant variable called worksheets, and it's just going to be the short reference to the worksheets of my workbook. And now, you're used to saying, once I get a reference to that collection of worksheets, I can just refer to any of the properties of that worksheet. But there are dozens and dozens of properties, and it's kind of expensive in this environment, kind of going back and forth between JavaScript and Excel. It's a little bit expensive to say, I want to bring in all the properties. And so instead, you say you're going to tell Excel which properties you're interested in. And so the one that I'm interested in here, the property that I'm interested in my worksheets is all the individual items. And so I'm saying, listen, I want to load up those properties so I have access to them, and then I'm going to call sync. That then is going to say, great, go ahead and go get all the different items, which is the individual worksheets for that worksheets collection, and make those properties available to me. And so this load is kind of a weird thing, but it's basically you can't go directly after the properties because you've got to say, these are the properties I want to work with first, and that's what load allows you to do. Now here I'm making two arrays. Remember, an array is what's inside of square brackets in JavaScript. And so I'm making an empty array here called sheet names and one called sheet names sorted. So I've got two different arrays. And now, because I've loaded the items of the worksheet, I can now iterate across these items. So here's a for each loop in JavaScript. So for, and then I've got, we'll talk about this here in just a second. So this is what tells us, what we're going to deal with. And then opening brace here, closing brace here, everything inside that is going to happen over and over again, once for each of the items in the collection. But the way I do it is I say, listen, I'm going to have a variable here called WS, and it's going to get bound onto every element in this collection. This is exactly analogous to the for each loop that we have in VBA. So each time through this loop, syntax is just a little bit different, but each time through this loop, WS is going to refer to a different one of these items. And so here we have this object, or this array, sheet names, and I'm now going to add an element into that array. So arrays are really different in JavaScript than they are in VBA. In VBA, an array is a primitive data type. It doesn't have any methods. It's just a block of memory. But in JavaScript, an array is an object. So it has methods that you can use to work with it. And once you've worked with arrays that have methods, you'll go, wow, I never want to go back. Because we don't have to worry about redimming the array to the right size to be able to have the right number of elements to do with what I'm doing. You can just say, great, I've got this array. I want to put another item into the array, and it has a push method. And so I'm going to add all the names of my worksheets into that array. I'm also going to add the names of all the worksheets into the sorted array. It's not sorted yet, but ultimately we're going to sort those items. And so at this point, maybe I'll just do this, is that after I get here, I'm going to want to kind of take a look at what those are. Now in VBA, if I wanted to print out an array, I couldn't just say print the array. I would have to say print the array sub1, the first position, sub2, sub3, sub4. But here I can just say, no, I just print out that whole array, which is kind of nice. Instead of saying debug.print, I say console.log. And then in parentheses, your arguments always go in parentheses in JavaScript. I'm just going to go ahead and print out one of these arrays. I'll do sheet names. And let me go ahead and add in a return here. So return is like exit for, or exit function. So it just says, hey, at this point, get me out of here. So we haven't talked about what's happening here below. So I just want to go ahead and do this. Again, all we're doing is we're declaring some arrays and we're filling those arrays with the names of the worksheets and then printing out one of those arrays. And this is create worksheets. No, I don't want create worksheets. This is sort worksheets. So I'll choose sort worksheets and I'll run it. Now, just like in VBA, when you do a debug.print, where does it go? It goes to the immediate window, which may or may not be visible. The way that I get to the place that that console.log happens is I'm going to right click here and I'm going to choose inspect. So it's going to open up the same object inspector that we've used when we were working with, trying to understand how to work with Chrome. And so I've got the elements, which would be the ones that I was interested in working with Chrome, but the console.log goes to the console tab. And so should be at the bottom here, should be the last thing that I did a console.log. Here it is. So here's an array. It's kind of collapsed down right now. It says there are 6 elements in it. And if I open that up, I can see the elements in the array. So instead of like debug.print just gives me a single value, this is more like the locals window where I can see kind of more complex structures and see their values of them. Okay, questions? of show me where you are coming along with me, 0 to 5. 0 is, wow, I'm glad this isn't on the test. And 5 is, I think I'm following what you're doing. I couldn't do it, but I think with a little bit of work, I could get there. So I'm seeing 4s, 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 and people who are not voting. Okay. All right. So we now have these 2 arrays that just have the names of the sheets in them. I'll go ahead and get rid of the return here. Unfortunately, so there is some kind of debugging that you can do with JavaScript, but the truth is I'm not familiar with it at all. So like, can you step through? I just don't know. I guess we were actually going to do some stuff in here. We learned how to do that, but I just don't know how to do it. But it's definitely not as easy just kind of setting a breakpoint and going line by line the way we do in VBA. Okay, let's see. This is doing a case insensitive sort. I'm going to simplify this code. This will be a case sensitive sort. But interesting thing is that one of the methods that arrays have is a sort method. You can just say, array, sort yourself. And so I've got sheet names sorted, and that's just going to sort that array in place. So let me go ahead and print out here sheet names sorted. Then return. And so now here we can see I've got the first one that printed, which is my sheet names. And then, oh, sheet names sorted doesn't look sorted. Did I actually spell it right? Oh no, I printed the same one twice. So this should be sheet names sorted. So we look here, we can see those 2 are printed there in the same order. I'm going to go ahead and run it again. And now we can see first one is in that order, and now this one now has been ordered. So we haven't done anything to the sheets yet. We've done to the array that we read the names of the sheets in. That array is now sorted. And so let's take a look at what we're doing next. So we've got here another for each loop. So we're going for each sheet name and our sheet name sorted. And we are going to make another constant here called index. And that's going to be the index of that sheet name. So we are looking back to our sheet names, our unsorted array. We're going through the array that's sorted, and we're picking up the index of that sheet name in our unsorted array. And then we're saying that the worksheet using that index, so just the same way that we can refer to worksheets by their name or their ordinal position in VBA, we can do the same thing here. And we're taking that particular worksheet based on the index that we found, and we're setting its position to the end of the list. And so we're putting it there to the length of our sheet names array -1. Arrays in JavaScript are 0-based, just like they are in VBA. And so that is going to change the position of those sheets. And then we're going to call Excel sync one more time, which should then sort the sheets. So right now we've got sheet 1, Evercrisp Fuji. Ambrosia should end up as the first one once you run this, now that we're actually doing the sorting. We'll scroll over here. Ambrosia, Evercrisp, Fuji, Golden Delicious. So just kind of another example about working with these objects from JavaScript. Questions here? Okay, so you might be wondering, well, gosh, how do we find out what all the things are that we can do? And the answer is, yeah, there should be like a little button right up here, kind of points out to the right, that gives you just information about the add-in. And so if I follow the Get Support link, that should open up documentation for Jade. And I'm going to come here to the reference page. No, the support page. There we go. So, Jade is just kind of the tools to let you do this development directly in here in the workbook, but the language that you're working with is called the Office, the JS Office, JavaScript Office API. And so I've got links to some of the main parts of that documentation. So if you want to know what you can do to manipulate a range, we'll follow this link. And this should take us to the Microsoft documentation for the range class using the Office add-in API reference. And so these are the properties that are available. And here's the methods that are available. And there's examples of things that you can do down here in the documentation for each of the methods. Of course, there's never as many examples as you'd like, but kind of the main ones that you're after are here. So in Jade, we typically call the Excel object Excel. But generally speaking, where we would say Excel in Jade, over here they say context. And the reason is because this is the same language for automating Word, PowerPoint, Excel, and Outlook. And so because the context is the application that you're working with. So because in general terms, you don't know if you're working with Excel or Word or PowerPoint or Outlook, they use the general term context. So you'll notice they've got this context.sync in here, whereas we would say in Jade Excel.sync. And I made that distinction when I was creating the environment because I thought it would be easier for beginning students who are only working in Excel to see Excel.sync instead of wondering what is this context.sync all about. But we certainly could name that the same way just by, instead of calling what gets passed in here, instead of calling it Excel, if we were to change this to context, then it would match the examples that we see over there. So that's that's kind of getting into the documentation from Microsoft on what's available here. And so range, worksheet, chart on the Excel API itself. This is kind of the high level version of all the documentation. Okay, just for kicks, let's take a look at delete sheets. So we've got another function down here in the module that we imported called delete sheets. I'm going to go ahead and make that my active function. So in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, listen, here's the sheets that we created by the code. It's not the same ones that we have because we wrote that code and put in Golden, Delicious, some others that weren't done here. But this is making an array of sheet names, just hard-coded, not reading them off the worksheet. And then it's going to use a for next loop to try to go through and delete the sheet by that name. So we are getting the item. So we're telling it we want to delete the sheet by that name. You'll remember that that prepares us to do what we want it to do. And when we call Excel.sync is when it actually does it. Now, you're familiar with setting up an error trap using like on error resume next in VBA. It's a little bit different in JavaScript. It's called the try catch block. And it just says, hey, try to do what's inside this first set of braces. And if it succeeds, great. If not, then you're going to come to the catch. You're going to get, you remember that we dealt with an ERR object, like ERR.number or ERR.description, that would let us know which error happened. Here, that's just passed into whatever variable you name it here. So if there is an error, we're going to log out what that error is, and we're actually going to print that in the Jade environment. I'll show you where that prints. That's going to print that out. It's going to print that out. So the point here is that we can kind of do the same thing. If something fails, we don't have to stop the code. We can keep moving on. So we're going to try to delete a bunch of sheets that don't exist, and we're going to log those errors out, and I'll kind of show you where it prints it right here in the environment. So I'll run that, and it should delete some because some of them are named right. Evercrisp and Fuji are in there. Those should get deleted. Pink Lady was one we came up with. Golden Delicious we came up with. So that's not in the example. They didn't get deleted. We tried to delete Jonathan, but it didn't fail because when we tried to sync it, it said, oh, that didn't work. So go to the catch and we'll do jade.print. We'll print that out. Well, you can see the printing console by coming to the output section here. So these things we just printed, not able to delete a worksheet called Brayburn, probably doesn't exist, Honeycrisp, Gala, all these. So we can do error trapping, and it's pretty straightforward, maybe even simpler than it is dealing with VBA. All right, what else do we have in the walkthrough? Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and make a new workbook here for this next example. And come to home, I'll open up my Jade environment. And I'm gonna import my second module. So let me come back to, let's see, where's our, oh, here it is. So I've got the second gist, another example. And this example that we're going to load is kind of like a fully, it's like a more full-featured example of some of the things we can do here. So if I can remember to copy, paste, and we'll say import. Okay. You may have noticed when we first made that code module, it had a procedure called autoexec. Autoexec gets executed either when you first import a module or once that module's been put in here, once you open the add-in. So let me just go ahead and close the add-in here. And I've imported that module. I'm going to go ahead and open that add-in back up, and it's going to automatically launch the little application that we just loaded in. And so what this does is it's going to build an invoice for a fictitious DNA laboratory company. So we'll say build invoice, and it's for me, it built an invoice with only one item on it. So this is some kind of company called Covefront Laboratories in Cabot Cove, Maine. And apparently they're doing some work for a hospital in Finland. They did some Wolfram syndrome panel, whatever that is. And they charged $2,000 for that. Now, trouble is, that's dollars. And these guys over in Finland don't pay in dollars. What do they pay in? Is Finland on euros? I don't know. What I'd like to do is convert that. Well, it turns out that that's what this example is going to allow me to do. So this is going to make a request off to Alpha Advantage using an API key that I'll have to supply. And it's going to actually go pull the current exchange rate between, the exchange rate for this moment between dollars and whatever it is they use there. So let me go ahead and go to my email to pick up my code. Give me a second to get logged in. Why, yes, that is me. And we're going to go to my emailed that key to myself so I could get at it for just such an emergency. Okay, so I should be able to drop this API key in here and convert this invoice into euros. So they are in euros. So I could now build another invoice. This one is for United Kingdom. Convert that, and that one's going to convert into pounds. So by the way, we can go back and forth. Once we've got that data, we can have our code take us back and forth between those two currencies. So this is just, just kind of I mean, you could look at the code that's behind this. As you might imagine, it's quite a bit more involved than what we did here. But this is just to show that we can do a lot of the same kinds of things, making requests off to an external web source to be able to pick up data and so forth. Okay, so that's a walkthrough on using Jade. If you're already comfortable with JavaScript, this might be something that's interesting to you. If you find yourself in an environment where you can't use VBA, this is another way to be able to do automation. And this is kind of the way that you have to do it if you're going to do automation that's going to be available on the online version of Excel, because it is not, there's no VBA, just no VBA allowed there. Whew, so that's it. Questions on Jade? Just show me, having seen this, show me on a scale of 0 to 5, how much you think I should share this with the next, this is the first time I've ever taught it in class, how much I should share this with next semester's class. How many are going, yeah, not worth it? And somebody going, this might be interesting. 5, 5, 5, do vote here if you're here. So 4s and 5s, okay. So yeah, are you gonna ever use this? I don't know, but at least now you've been exposed to it. You could find it and do it if necessary. We got about 5 minutes. Any questions about the exam? Yes. Final study guide is posted. It's on the last day of class in the schedule. You can take it anytime during the final exam period. I think the average time to complete is less than an hour for this exam. There's always someone who takes 3 or 4 hours. I don't know, they just love it. So. Let me do tell you also, I'm not sure if I told you this, but the way that I do grades kind of at the end, the dean tells me you're not allowed to have a GPA above a certain thing. And so I try to make the class, mostly in the exams, hard enough that we don't go above that. But she tells me I can't make it above that. So I tell her I'm not going to make it below that either. And so kind of wherever we are, if you're usually what ends up happening is I've got enough room in the GPA that if you're close to the next grade up, you get the next grade up. Depending on how much room we have, you may not have to be that close and you might end up with it. And then kind of after we've gone up that next one grade, if I still have room, I kind of look in a little bit in the lower part of the distribution and I say, well, maybe you didn't quite get bumped up because you weren't quite close enough. I'm going to bump you up a little bit. Just because we don't have that many people in the lower part of the distribution and I can do a little more for them and still have room and be fair. So if you're kind of really worried about your grade down at the lower end of the distribution, you might be pleasantly surprised with the grade that ends up getting posted. And again, that all depends on how much room I have to kind of still be compliant. Actually, I think they said 3.6. I'm not supposed to be above 3.6, but over the years, I found out I don't get in trouble unless I'm actually above 3.7. So we'll have a little more room to kind of work in there. So. Plus I'm retiring in 2 years. And so there's not much they could do if I even violate that. So I'll try to take care of you. Other questions? All right, let's call it good there for today. Thanks for coming and class dismissed.